If you're like me, you probably enjoy playing violent video games on occasion. You might enjoy Doom, you might enjoy Manhunt or Call of Duty, or even games kind of like Fortnite, which are ultimately cartoony, are kind of violent because you shoot people in the face and try to be the last person left alive. I would view this as a fun afternoon spent on a hobby somewhat disconnected from reality, but there's people in our society, in our government, and in positions of power that wouldn't necessarily agree with you. For an example, on February 14th, 2018, a mass shooting occurred at Stoneman Douglas High School. 14 students and 3 faculty members lost their lives when a former student armed with an AR-15 styled rifle entered the campus and began shooting people indiscriminately. It was a nightmare, it was horrific, and it was a very, very dark day not only for the state of Florida, but for the nation as a whole. When tragedies strike, we like to try to find meaning in it. We like to try to understand what happened, what could be done better, what preventative measures could be taken. And in the aftermath of the school shooting, the media drug out all of the usual suspects to try and figure out what happened. There were gun control lobbyists, there were pro and anti-gun lobbyists, the NRA was on board.
Listen to me now, and never forget these words. To stop a bad guy with a gun, it takes a good guy with a gun. Thank you very much.
And that's why I support the things that I have stood for and fought for during my time
More
there.
NRA money, more NRA money.
There was the mental health is the real issue crowd. You had culture critics saying that our media was making us more or less violent, desensitized.
What has changed? Could it be our overall culture has undergone a toxic shift? Matt Bevin is the governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Recently suggested that violent video games and TV shows have created a, quote, desensitized culture.
There were demands for increased school security, including arming teachers.
I asked Superintendent Robert Runcie how he feels about arming teachers.
How do you feel about arming teachers?
I am absolutely adamantly opposed to it.
There was blaming police or FBI for their mistakes.
Plus, you know, I got to watch some deputy sheriffs performing this weekend. They weren't exactly Medal of Honor winners, all right? The way they performed was, frankly, disgusting.
And most relevant to today, there was those who blame entertainment.
We have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it, and also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
There is a group of people that exist in our society, some of them in positions of power, that want to blame violent video games and movies and music for creating violent killers that go on mass shootings. The simplest version of their belief on the issue is kind of like the old computing term of garbage in, garbage out. You put garbage code into a computer, you get garbage out of it. In a similar vein, if you take a person and you show them violent inputs constantly, it's not surprising that you get violent inputs out. So it would only be logical to ban or greatly restrict these inputs so that children and young adults would not get garbage inputs or violent inputs, and therefore would not be violent or a danger to our society. Right? Well, today we're going to take a look at the history of moral panics and censoring media. We are going to be examining the effects of censored media because this is a cycle that repeats itself throughout our history in the United States, at least. We're going to focus only in the United States today. I know it's a little bit different for Asian and European cultures, but we're just going to focus on censored media in the United States as a result of a moral panic. And in order to do so, we need to go way back in time, all the way to silent films. Yes, we had issues with censorship in silent films. In the early 1900s, silent films were the newest type of media. Films in general were by far the newest type of media. States and governments didn't really know what to do with them, so most films were subject to state censorship boards or regulated by industrial agencies inside that state, because a film was not viewed as a work of art, rather it was viewed as a commercial production. This was, of course, for moral reasons, because the powers that be at the time were really concerned about scandalous things like a woman's leg being shown to children, potential violence like people getting shot at with blanks and falling over, midriffs being shown, or any sort of anti-government or anti-religious message. The first Supreme Court case for films, and in this case it was all silent films, was Mutual Film Corp versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio, and that was the group that censored films in the state of Ohio at the time. Mutual Film Corp produced produced a lot of early Charlie Chaplin films, some of which you may have seen before. Censorship was not popular with the audience at large at the time. It was lampooned in papers and amongst the population, and reshoots were very costly to the film production company because, well, film was tiny and budgets were tight. So less censorship meant more money to the company. It was also very important to their artists as an issue of freedom of speech, and it allowed them to make racier films that appealed to a wider audience. So when the State Film Censorship Board wanted to ban some of their films, they claimed it was a freedom of expression issue and took it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Surprisingly, at least by our standards today, the Supreme Court ruled against the Mutual Film Corp, stating, quote, "The exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, originated and conducted for profit, not to be regarded nor intended to be regarded by the Ohio Constitution, we think, as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion." Now, obviously we know that movies aren't censored today, so that had to change, but an interesting note that this happened so long ago that many of the judges that were making a decision on this case were born before film was even a thing, and odds were not unlikely that they had not seen very many silent films, if any at all. Not too long after this decision, you had some more liberal groups fighting for less media restrictions, and unfortunately, Birth of a Nation came out, which was a technically innovative movie that changed almost everything you know about modern movies that included framing, special effects, scene transitions, length, structure. They had moving cameras, they had dolly cameras, they had just about every single thing that you think of in a modern movie in Birth of a Nation. Unfortunately, it was one of the most offensive movies ever because it was an incredibly racist movie where the KKK were the heroes and the Southerners were heroes and black people were basically evil. And this movie was so offensive, it's difficult to even show it these days without people protesting. And at the time, it was so offensive that more liberal groups like the NAACP fought to strengthen state censors so that those censors would have the right to keep the movie banned. Of course, movies continued to progress and continue to do new things and become increasingly racy over time. The debate died down during World War II, but eventually in 1952, the Supreme Court case of Joseph Burstyn Inc. versus Wilson, the decision on films not being considered free speech was reversed. The film in question was called The Miracle. It was based on a very old French stage play, and the film was considered by the New York State Film Censor to be sacrilegious and anti-Catholic, and they fought to keep it banned because it was a blasphemous film. The company behind the film obviously wanted to exhibit it and show it and have it run for money and for whatever artistic purposes they had. Surprisingly, in this case, the Supreme Court ruled against the state censor, citing freedom of expression on the part of the artist of the film, freedom of exhibition, and it was considered a miracle decision not just because of the name, but because the lawyers at the time were optimistically hoping for films to be reconsidered freedom of expression for perhaps a documentary, or perhaps a historical purpose, or perhaps just an artistic purpose, and not a blanket freedom of expression across the board. So eventually films were allowed to be uncensored in the United States. During a similar time frame as this, pinball machines were actually banned in New York and Los Angeles. This might seem crazy to some of you, but they were considered corrupting to the moral fabric of the youth and also viewed as gambling. Not unlike some other problem that we're facing today in gaming that's so complex we'll do it in an entirely different video. To be fair, older pinball machines were not like the ones you see today. Most had no flippers, and where the ball launched and landed was almost entirely random. Players, who were mostly kids and young men, could go on streaks and save up the free games that they won and later cash them out with the owner of the establishment so that instead of playing their 20 or so free games, they could just take the cash from them and leave and be on about their day. It really was a kind of gambling for kids, and it's a lot like how Japanese pachinko is today, where you can't gamble in Japan and pachinko machines are essentially random, and instead of winning money, you'll win a bear or a small prize. But at the store next door, you can take that small prize and sell it for $50, $100, $300, however much it's worth. Even with the addition of flippers to the pinball machines and no cashing out of the prizes, the perception at the time was that pinball is gambling. The machines were first banned in New York. They were confiscated and destroyed. Los Angeles enacted a very similar ban, and so did Chicago and most of the other big cities, and they would continue to be banned from 1930 until about the late 1970s. Here you can see images of the New York City Police Commissioner and later the mayor destroying pinball machines as a show of force for the press. It was considered awesome that the mayor was destroying pinball machines. However, the popularity of pinball never really went away. People just kept playing it, except they played it in underground or in illegal places, or they just went across state lines to another state, and the bans didn't have that big of an effect on the playership. Eventually, times changed, and they would later become viewed as games of skill instead of chance. Pinball was eventually unbanned in the 1970s thanks to changes in regulation both in New York and California. It was successfully argued that pinball was a game of skill, especially with the addition of the flippers, and not a game of chance, and therefore should be governed by local gambling regulatory agencies or not regulated at all. The similarity of these two examples, both in the film censorship in the early 1900s and the pinball censorship in the mid-1900s, is one of a moral panic. There was a strong belief in parents and in the government at the time that racy movies or light gambling would completely corrupt youth. This corrupted youth would be immoral, violent, uncontrollable, and generally a menace to society. In the case of pinball, churches and schools argued that it would encourage youth to steal coins, to skip school, and even go hungry in order to feed their gambling addiction. And yes, this was a time in America where churches were so influential that what they had to say about an issue was considered most of the time. We all know that this is completely untrue and silly just at face value, but it struck really hard at the fears of parents. And the attitude kind of reminds me of this scene from The Music Man, where he tries to get pool halls banned so that it's less competition for him. Now, this is a musical and it's a movie, so I'm going to try really hard to avoid a copyright strike. I'm going to keep these clips short and edited, but I think that this very, very accurately strikes home the sort of attitudes, ideas, and the moral panic of people that wanted to censor films and restrict pool halls.
Say it takes judgment, brains, and maturity to score in a bop-line game. I say that any boob can take and shove a ball in a pocket. And I call that sloth. The first big step on the road to the depths of degradation. I say first, medicinal wine from a teaspoon, then beer from a bottle. And the next thing you know, your son is playing for money in a pinchback suit. And listening to some big out-of-town Jasper, hearing him tell about horse race gambling. Now, friends, let me tell you what I mean. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pockets in a table. Pockets that mark the difference between a gentleman and a bum with a capital B, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. And all week long, your River City youth will be frittering away. I say your young men will be frittering. Frittering away their noontime, supper time, chore time too. Get the ball in the pocket. Never mind tail young ones. Peeking in the pool hall window after school. You got trouble, folks, right here in River City. Trouble with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. Now, I know all you folks are the right kind of parents. I'm going to be perfectly frank. Would you like to know what kind of conversation goes on while they're loafing around that hall? They were trying out Bevo, trying out Q-Babs, trying out tailor-mades like cigarette fiends, and bragging all about how they're going to cover up a telltale breath with Sen one fine night.
Moving along, as film and pinball restrictions were winding down, a new moral panic struck the land. This time, it was comic books. Violent, scary, and surprisingly sexualized comic books. These comics were getting increasingly adult, yet still very accessible to children and very, very cheap. In some cases, they were sitting on shelves and you couldn't even avoid them. Once again, there was a moral panic of concerned parents and politicians that didn't want their children seeing things like this for fear that it would ruin their little young minds. Before anything crazy happened, the comic book industry banded together and set up a sort of self-censorship board called the Comics Code Authority. Since this one's a little more modern, you may have heard of it, but it was modeled after most of the old film censorship boards that we talked about earlier that governed the silent films, except this time it was a sort of inter-comic book or inter-industrial agency and not a governmental one. Pretty much every single comic book published had to be approved through the Comics Code Authority for almost 30 years. They were successful in scaling back violence, sexuality, language, and just about anything remotely offensive from comic books. It was during this time that the Joker in Batman went from a murdering psychopath to really more of a joke, a clown, an actual clown, I should say. And it was also during this time that Superman went through his weird Jimmy Olsen phase. Oh God, what the hell were they thinking? The Comics Code Authority had near complete control of comic book content until the late 1970s. During this time, our old pal Richard Nixon was knee-deep in his war on drugs. In order to make this anti-drug message of his reach children, which at the time there was a very big drug culture amongst teens and children, kind of like the late end of the hippie phase, he reached out to Marvel Comics and Stan Lee to make an anti-drug comic book. However, the CCA didn't allow drugs even if it was an anti-drug message, which I find to be paradoxical. It was sort of a blanket ban on drugs. Even if it was to show a horrible drug addiction or how to identify drugs, you couldn't show drugs in comic books. Stan Lee agreed to the project and would eventually release Spider-Man number 96, 97, and 98, which features Spider-Man's friend Harry becoming addicted to drugs. Fun side note, in this case, the pills he was taking was LSD. But the Comics Code Authority never approved this and actually tried to, as a show of force, stop the comic books from being produced because it violated their rules on drugs. Well, Stan Lee was like, yeah, but I got the president on my side. What are you going to do about it? And he published it anyway. This single act marked the beginning of the end of the Comics Code Authority, and it helped establish Stan Lee even more in the field of comic books. Rumor has it he's doing really well these days. In a couple of years, the CCA pretty much completely crumbled and comics became deregulated. I don't even need to show of an example of a violent comic book these days, but I will because they're awesome. I read a lot of comic books. Image Comics for life. You can see the exact same trappings of a moral panic here, that something offensive or racy or sexy is being shown to children, and the parents flip out about it. As a result of that, something gets banned or restricted for a couple of decades, but is eventually released back to the public, but not without limiting artistic expression and wasting everybody's time and money. The first three examples of moral panics and censorship that we have talked about today have been very, very old and things that aren't very relevant today. However, the next two examples of moral panics overlap closer with our modern time frames and are much darker in tone. They have actual real-world consequences and deaths involved, so please do prepare yourselves for a sudden tonal shift here. Let's take a look at the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, which was a committee formed in 1985 to limit children's access to music that was considered violent, drug-related, sexual, or satanic in nature. This was, in effect, a gigantic and influential censorship board. You may remember it best for the parental advisory stickers that were put on CDs up until the very late 1990s. Paradoxically, sometimes this just helped sell the CDs more because kids knew that's where the cool stuff was. But this board sought to limit the reach and the music of some artists such as Prince, Madonna, AC/DC, and Twisted Sister. In the case of Twisted Sister, the group may have bit off more than they can chew. The most famous of the original 4 board members of the PMRC was Tipper Gore, Al Gore's then wife. He wasn't vice president yet, but he was still very famous and on his upward rise in politics. They actually called Dee Snider of Twisted Sister before Congress to testify about his music and answer questions. Tipper Gore wanted to question him about the lyrics that she considered violent, sexual, or just downright dirty, and he had this to say about it.
In this article, Ms. Gore claimed that one of my songs, Under the Blade, had lyrics encouraging sadomasochism, bondage, and rape. The lyrics she quoted have absolutely nothing to do with these topics. On the contrary, the words in question are about surgery and the fear that it instills in people. Furthermore, the reader of this article is led to believe that the 3 lines she quotes go together in the song, when, as you can see from reading the lyrics, the first 2 lines she cites are an edited phrase from the 2nd verse, and the 3rd line is a misquote of a line from the chorus. That the writer could misquote me is curious, since we make it a point to print all our lyrics on the inner sleeve of every album. As the creator of Under the Blade, I can say categorically that the only sadomasochism, bondage, and rape in this song is in the mind of Ms. Gore. Now, it strikes me that the PMRC may have confused our video presentation for this song with the meaning of the lyrics.
That congressional hearing and the level of that shutdown severely limited the aspirations of the PMRC from hoping to become perhaps a governmental type agency to more of a voluntary one that stores just put a label on just because. And again, kids kept listening to music, and again, they didn't really get more violent, nothing changed, and music censorship isn't even an issue that's discussed very much these days. It has just kind of died down in general. This was a censorship aspiration that ended very quickly. During an overlapping time frame with the PMRC, or the parental advisory warnings that were put on CDs, is this strange episode in the 80s and 90s called the Satanic Panic, because there was a widespread belief that the music was satanic, that the bands were cultists, that the work that they were doing was the work of Satan, and that there were satanic cults actively doing things in the United States, which I stuttered on because it still seems crazy to me. But this one hits home for me because I was a kid during this time, and my parents made decisions based on what activity levels they thought satanic cults were up to in my area. Now, this moral panic, the Satanic Panic, started with kind of a slow boil in the 60s and 70s with the decline of the spiritualist and transcendentalist sort of movement in the United States, and ex-hippies kind of waking up and realizing that smoking weed doesn't put you on another plane. And it also overlaps with various authors publishing books on, quote, true stories about Satanism, about their time in a cult or their wife getting kidnapped. Pretty much all of these stories were later debunked, but the idea stuck in the minds of the population. You mix that in with the proliferation of very scary movies about satanic things, like The Exorcist, some very popular books. It was at a time where VHS tapes were first beginning to get shared, so you had VHS Christian pop propaganda about satanic cults and bands and ritual abuse and how heavy metal is Satan worship, and you get a full-blown panic about satanic cults. And I say panic because people were literally scared. There were hour-long specials on TV news about satanic activity in the United States.
You have to give a blood sacrifice to Satan. It's supposed to keep you protected. It's supposed to keep you pure.
They said that if we told that the devil would come and kill our parents.
It doesn't matter if you believe in Satan. It doesn't matter if you believe in demons. What's important is to know that there are people out there that do, and they're willing to do anything to accomplish their goal.
Satanism is more than a hodgepodge of mysticism and fantasy, more than a Halloween motif. It's a violent impulse that preys on the emotionally vulnerable, especially teenagers, often lonely and lost.
It basically started out like with the killing of animals. Then there's always the heavy metal music, and drugs don't help.
But we are certain that Satanism exists. To some, it's a religion. To others, it's the practice of evil in the devil's name. It exists, and it's flourishing. Members of our studio audience tonight will attest to that. They are friends and foes of Satanism, devil worshippers and law enforcers, experts and victims. They'll help us understand this force that exalts evil and darkness.
There were actual police officers who in this case were obviously bullshitting, but did it anyway for the money. They were paid to make anti-Satanist training videos to train police officers on how to identify satanic cult-based activity.
The program is designed to help law enforcement officers better understand satanic cults.
And so, well, see, here you go. Upon entering the park, I mean, you can see they've already got started.
Rebaptism in Satan's name and taking a new name to replace the given Christian name. An oath of allegiance to Satan while standing in a magic circle, entering the initiate's name in the Book of Death. And a promise to sacrifice children to Satan and marking the initiate with the devil's mark.
Another area that's obvious in these kinds of ritualistic carvings would be the pentagram or the inverted pentagram on the right and the left side of the upper chest. This oftentimes is the signature of the high priest. Another area that you might find satanic ritual carving is in the stomach area. And as was true in the St. Joseph's case, the pentagram or the inverted pentagram was carved right here in his abdomen area. And you'll note again the points representing again the goat's head.
There were bands that were sued for supposedly having satanic messages in their vinyl records if you played it backward, or subliminal messages in general. And there were a ton of direct-to-video warning videos made about how to deal with Satanists.
And then in the beginning it said, we shall rule the afterwards forever. So I just figured, you know, join Satan and, you know, you'd have the power, you'd be able to take over the whole world.
This fear about Satanism also overlapped with Dungeons and Dragons because the monsters and the mythology and using magic overlapped with a lot of what people were kind of afraid of with Satanism. So there was a move to ban Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons & Dragons is one of over 300 fantasy role-playing games on the market today. At least 4 million players have accepted the invitation to enter into the fantasy dream world of sorcery, swords, and demons.
Well, actually, the figure by the National Coalition on Television Violence is documented more than 125 cases of either suicide or murder directly attributable to Dungeons and Dragons.
There was even a TV movie made starring Tom Hanks about playing Dungeons and Dragons and how they called it Mazes and Monsters, which was like definitely totally not Dungeons and Dragons, and how it sort of pulls him into hysteria and blurs his reality about monsters and reality, where he ends up accidentally murdering somebody. Today, we all laugh at this and say it's completely ridiculous, because it is, but it had very real effects. In Kern County, California, there were 26 people who were sentenced to 40 years in prison for the ritual abuse of children as related to satanic practices. All of those convictions were later overturned about 20 years later after several of these people spent time in prison. There were various murders that were attributed to Satanism or satanic cults, and the most famous of these kind of trials was the McMartin Daycare Satanic Ritual Abuse Trial. In short, as I could talk about this for a long time, there were numerous parents and children claiming that kids were sexually abused during satanic rituals that operated in secret at the daycare. One of the things that really made this trial go on for a long time and got people interested in it is that very young children, ages, 4, just talking 5, 6, 7, 8, were telling very wild and vivid tales about the orgies and rape and sacrifices, and they were talking about people in robes and black hoods and stabbing virgins and very graphic sexual acts, either between adults and children. Then they started talking about seeing Satan, and they talked about the daycare workers levitating and killing people with lightning, and eventually one of the kids said that even Chuck Norris stopped by to take part in the abuse. Basically, at a young age, these children had learned from glances of other media, particularly some of the stuff that we discussed earlier about how scary Satanism could be, or some of the Christian propaganda about black magic, and some of the movies like The Exorcist and other horror movies. They learned from that what a satanic ritual abuse would probably look like, and more or less explained the things that they had seen in other forms of propaganda back to police detectives, and started this furious investigation into the criminal activity. The trial lasted for 7 years. Many lives were ruined. Many bank accounts were drained. Thankfully, in this case, no convictions were made because it was all kind of nonsense. Basically, none of it could be proved whatsoever in a court, and even some of the children would later recant their confessions as adults. Even years later, and I mean up to like 10 years later, people were still talking about the McMartin daycare, and they were talking about there being secret tunnels underneath the daycares that they could transport children in and out of from other places, which kind of reminds me about those supposed secret tunnels in Pizzagate, but again, that's a different story. However, growing up, my parents believed that this was real. They really literally believed that this was fact, and because of this, they made decisions that did affect my life as a child. All of this started from a moral panic, an innate fear fear of the unknown, of death, and for the desire of some small Christian groups to drum up that hate against Satanism or black magic or things that didn't really exist. And the propaganda that they created as an effect of that moral panic spread into the lives of others. It spread into the media in general. It put kind of strange ideas in the minds of children and even government officials that wanted to ban various things from Dungeons and Dragons to music. Now, finally, we have reached video games and the clip where we started.
We have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it, and also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
As of recording this video, Donald Trump has publicly stated that he plans to meet with the heads of the video game industry next week to talk about limiting video game violence and hopefully limiting violence in media in general. Unfortunately, nobody from any industry has said the White House has reached out to them for a meeting. Maybe it's all too fast. Maybe it's hullabaloo. I don't know. We'll see where this goes in a couple of days. But as of right now, it just kind of looks like hot air. However, sadly, banning video games is nothing new. There have been moral panics about the effects of violent video games on children since their very creation. Congress even held another very fun meeting on Mortal Kombat and Night Trap.
Our children and frankly and occasionally protecting the rest of us from our children, from minors, particularly in terms of their ability to obtain guns. Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. This gun, which is called a justifier, in other words, this is the handheld implement with which you play the game by shooting it at the screen, and the more successful you are, the more powerful the gun becomes.
I played Mortal Kombat in the 90s when it was the game. It was on every news channel. It was so violent. It was horrible. You kill people. And it does look a little bit more real than a lot of the things at the time because they did motion capture actors, but now we would consider it laughable. Night Trap is a neat but weird game where you kind of control a horror movie. It's kind of like an early version of Until Dawn, but you use traps to stop bad guys from murdering this family. The violence is laughable now, but it still has a sort of creepy voyeuristic vibe and lots of like exposed nipples under shirts and sexualized images, stuff that kids probably didn't need to see, but it was far from the worst thing that you would have run into in the 90s.
This isn't gonna work. You're not scaring me. Wait. What are you doing? No! Hit me up!
And it was considered then that violent video games needed to be regulated to prevent violent youth from growing up, which would be now. However, if you look at any crime statistic, you'll see that violent crime is at an all-time low. That crime peaked in the 80s, and since the 90s, it's been steadily declining. If you want to get technical about it, it's only dropped even lower since consoles and violent video games have become the norm, and even sometimes the more violent the game, the lower the crime. Perhaps a different way to think about it is that basically all young people today play video games, and let's be honest, most of them are at least a little bit violent. Even some of the nicer games out there like League of Legends or Warcraft or Overwatch or Fortnite, which is all the rage at the moment, are somewhat violent. It might be cartoony violence, but it's still violence all the same. If video games made people violent, then we should be living in an apocalyptic hellscape by now. Every single person should be out there killing each other. It should be the worst fears from RoboCop come to life. And even if that argument means nothing to you, perhaps just look at the historical examples from today. The overarching lesson from history is that new forms of entertainment are always detested by the powers that be. They dislike them because they are offensive, because they're sexualized, because they're violent, because they corrupt youth, because of a lot of type of things. And in most cases, the initial moral panic wins, and the new type of media struggles schools under some form of censorship. However, entertainment censorship never lasts long. There are casualties along the way. People go to jail, people lose their lives, people lose their money, but usually over a time of about 20, 30 years, or roughly one generation, one group of young people that grow up with this thing and don't become deformed or weird and usually kind of like it, it is done away with. And at no point in the last 100 years has any form of entertainment actually made people more violent. So perhaps banning violent video games or focusing on the violence in the media or trying to censor media in general is perhaps the wrong way to solve the school shooting problem. Guys, that is all for today's video. I hope that you learned something about it. I hope that some of this has been helpful for you. And if it was, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe.